We're very lucky to have Gary Mitchner here today to talk about poetry. He is Professor Emeritus of English and former Poet Laureate of Sinclair Community College. He's published in the Paris Review, the New Republic, and many other magazines, and he writes the Round Town column in the Oakwood Register. He and the loving spouse have lived in Oakwood since 1974 and have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. So please help me welcome Gary Mitchner.
Hello. Well, welcome. I have never done a webinar, so this is very strange. I'm actually just here, standing here looking at myself. My glasses are picking up the window I'm facing. I'm seeing a wonderful tree. And of course, the Wright brothers behind me. Too bad I didn't do a poem for the Wright brothers. We could have done that. But we're going to do a few exercises today and some reading. And I thought I should probably introduce those exercises. But first, let me thank Elizabeth for inviting me to do this, and the Wright Library, which of course is my spot to go these days. I have thousands and thousands of books, and as Elizabeth mentioned, I refer to my wife as the loving spouse, and she's afraid that all those books are going to fall into the kitchen because they're upstairs above that. So I've had to stop buying books, and Wright Library has been my oasis for the books that I like to read. Anyway, so we're going to try to do exercise and then some readings. And the reason why I'm doing these exercises, I of course taught poetry for many, many years at Sinclair, where I was the chair of the English department, and I had started many workshops there. As a matter of fact, I directed the Sinclair Writers Workshop, which is still going on, except for the hiatus of the pandemic. And I had several contests there. I did one in honor of Helen Peterson, who actually was the founder of the Writers Workshop. And I found that with my students, one of the best things to do would be to start with these kinds of exercises, especially one that I would used to call like a ventriloquist poem, or technically it was a dramatic monologue, one of my favorites. And I would always teach Robert Browning's My Last Duchess as a dramatic monologue. And the purpose for that was to get students to think about voice, but think first off about others' voices, not just their own voice, and to project and imagine the voice of another in a poem. And then I would do some other exercises where I would try to get them away from cliches. I can't tell you how many arguments I had with students about why you want to tell me something in a poem that I don't know. And of course, cliches represent basically a stop to thinking, because they're so automatic, and we're bombarded by these cliches. As a matter of fact, I keep in my journal a list of cliches that I can sort of twist around and use in different ways in my poems. And I then eventually would go on to teach them formal poetry. And then I would have a lot of questions about that, of course. They didn't understand why they needed to learn how to do iambic pentameter, why they had to write a Elizabethan sonnet, a Spenserian sonnet, or a Petrarchan sonnet. And I would make that as part of the course. And then, of course, I also gave them extra credit if they would memorize poems. I used John Hollander's book, Committed to Memory. I don't know if you know that book, but it's the best 100 poems to memorize. It's a great book for people to memorize. I was never really very good at memorizing poems myself, but I thought it was a nice exercise. So this, and I noticed recently, I don't know if you all read the paper, but on Sunday mornings, that's what I did this Sunday morning, I read the New York Times. And during this pandemic, they'd have a section called At Home, with different kinds of exercises for the family to do and for individuals. And they've been giving all these different exercises. I'm looking at one called Find a Headline and Write a Poem. They had another one called Find the Poetry Hidden in the Pages of Your Paper. And they even told you how to finish that short story that you started. So I've always been fond of these kinds of exercises. Poets have used them, to practice their meter and their rhyme and all of that. And I have found that they are a good sort of icebreaker to get started on writing. And I use this exercise that I'm going to introduce you today, which I stole from one of my teachers. My professors in the past have always given me exercises. One of my favorite teachers was the poet Carolyn Kaiser, and she made us write meter and dimeters and trimeters all the time. And I learned this particular exercise from John Ashbery. And when he introduced it, he talked about rebuses and how there are puzzles and what can help you to start writing. And he reminded us that James Merrill used the Ouija board to write The Changing Light at Sandower. And recently I've been looking at tarot cards and see if I can use those. But this exercise takes several passages from random books. So when I came into the library, I asked Elizabeth, show me where some of the reference books are. And I went to the shelf and I pulled off 3 passages from various books just randomly and asked her to make copies of those. So if you made copies, then you probably have those already in front of you and wondering what in the world this was going to have to do with poetry. And if you don't, then we're going to pull them up on the screen. And the instructions are basically that as you look through these, you can do this in various ways. I would like you to look at all 3 passages, and there's no rhyme or reason into what order, so you can do it in any order you want. And as you go through them, you might take a pencil or pen or whatever, and just go through and circle or underline or highlight anything that grabs you in terms of interesting diction. I don't want to say poetic diction because that sounds like purple prose, but any kind of phrase or even single word or whatever. You don't actually have to do it on your copy. If you're just looking at the screen, take a piece of paper and just write down. Actually, that's what I did. I don't know if you can see this, but I went through the passages. That's kind of hard to see. And just wrote down a few phrases and words. And after you get those done, another way, of course, would be just to go start reading it and scratch out everything you don't like and then look at what you end up with. And as I said, there's no order, but whatever will grab you in terms of vocabulary. I use this technique a couple times. One poem that I wrote about hitchhiking to Stonehenge back in the 70s with my wife, I happened to be reading about some of the theories about how they got those big stones there. So I used some of the vocabulary in my poem. So Elizabeth, why don't you pull up the first passage? She's going to share her screen, we hope. Okay. All right. Does everyone, if you do not see this or do not have a copy of this, I guess what they should do is just put that in the chat, Elizabeth, or ask a
Yes,
question.
I put the link in chat. If you want to, you can just follow that link and you can get all of the handouts.
Okay. And there are 3 of them. And as I say, it doesn't matter how many words or phrases or passages, but you should have a kind of a list. And after you get that list, then I'd like you to try to start writing something. This will be the workshop part of it. Obviously, we're not going to have time to write a complete poem. It is just an exercise. So we're not even going to call them poems. We're just going to call them an exercise. And I think we'll give you about 15, 20 minutes to go through these and read them very quickly. You're not reading for content, so it doesn't matter what the content is and what it's about, but you're looking for phrases or words. And then after the 15, 20 minutes, maybe some of you would like to share a little bit of what you wrote. We won't have time for everybody to share, but if we could have a few people share.
Okay, that's time.
Okay. Well, I came up with about 20 phrases, 20 words out of those 3 passages. How did the rest of you do? Is there anyone that would like to share? I'd like to know what you thought of this exercise, whether it inspired you in any way, or where you were frustrated with it, or, I mean, obviously some of you probably didn't even do it. That doesn't matter. But if you did attempt it, can you read a couple lines that you wrote, or what did you grabbed your attention? If you'd like to finish this later on, and you can email it to me, and Elizabeth will be giving you my email at the end of this, or on Monday, whatever. Is there anyone that'd like to, how do we do that, Elizabeth? Do they
Yes. So if you are interested in sharing, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can share your what you wrote down, or you can share things in the chat. I do see some things in the chat.
Yeah, somebody's asking whether they have audio capability. Do they?
Yeah, I got that. So let me
Okay.
just read from Patty. My phrases are worked into my quick writing. So her phrases are in the writing. It seemed to start slowly with reports dotted here and there. The newspaper headlines urged us that all would be contained. We were safe and far away. It would be foolish, however, to hide the gravity of the hour, for the virus was spreading invisibly quickly among us, and the lockdown, the curfew, the numbers rose, and the fear rose, and soon no one was going to work or shopping or walking the streets in San Francisco. We retreated into our homes and waited, hoping for the moment when we could look with confidence to science and stabilization. But things were different now. We were different now.
Very good. Obviously, the pandemic is on our minds.
Right.
Very good.
Yeah, so to the question, so if you would like to share, I can enable you to speak. So all you need to do is raise your hand if you would like to read what you wrote. And we'll give people a few minutes if they would like to do that.
Obviously, we're all going to probably come up with some of the same phrases. I heard some of the ones in hers that I had picked as well.
I can share what I wrote down. I mean, I have to say this, I thought it was super fun just because it makes you.
Okay. I didn't know you were doing it too. Okay, great.
Well, I thought, why not? So,
okay. What did you come up with?
Cursing war, famous shame of women, brush with dates, spring armies are a consequence of April and May, the banks of genius, and we disguise our foolishness with losses.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
A dogged remembering, and Bedlam in Bethlehem. Cross-dresser crying in hysteria, and no more pearls can be found after 300 searches.
Oh, very good. So
okay.
You did find it fun anyway, right?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, here's another.
Okay.
I'll just read from the chat. A Tonka jumped out from,
from
the phrases I wrote in the Churchill article. Dogged endurance, gravity of the hour, foolish to lose heart, invincible confidence, a sudden transformation.
Oh, very good. Very good. I never really taught Tonkas very much, or haikus, but those are great forms.
Okay, anyone else? Oh, okay.
Linda.
Linda. Okay. Go ahead, Linda.
She's still muted.
There we go.
There.
Yeah.
I think I chose the same one that everyone else chose. And I actually wrote a poem. I write pretty quickly generally, and then sometimes take years to edit.
Sure, that writing is about rewriting.
So I actually titled this, I called it Equipoise.
Oh, good.
It is twilight in the war, its scope grown monstrous, both armies ready to advance in this grave hour. One to conquer, one to defend. In the dim light of the hour, leaders call to action, summon courage, end courage. No one can know how this will end, countries conquered, how many lives lost. No time to lose heart. The world balanced on a splintered beam of hope.
Oh, wow. You did all that in that time. Very good, very good. Have you been to the Peace Museum?
It's on my list. I haven't been there yet.
Okay, yeah, I volunteer at the Peace Museum, so I'd like to invite you down there. Anyone else anyone else? Oh, we got two more. Okay. Tracy?
Okay, I just took the Japanese one.
Yeah.
I said, reciting this Pledge of Allegiance, such a normal routine. Japanese students whose parents immigrated here for a piece of the American dream, who celebrate both Japanese and American holidays. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, blasted through the radio as families sat around. Hysterica filled the air whenever and I put in quotes, Jap walked by.
Yeah.
No longer the Pledge of Allegiance, not a normal routine. You must be in by 10 p.m. because it talked about curfew.
Yeah.
The military police declared. Fear in both Americans and Japanese, torn by the fabric of war. No longer the Pledge of Allegiance were safe words. As they boarded the buses, tears flowed from their eyes. And that's as far as I got.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. And was there one other one?
Any others? Oh, so there's one in the chat
Okay.
from Janet. I can read that out loud. And
Okay.
Janet, I see that you shared that with a panelist. You might want to go ahead and share that again with all participants. So Janet wrote, the Pledge of Allegiance, burgeoning, deflects the bicultural lie of celebrated hysteria. A full-sized billboard bellows, get out. Then not a single Japanese walks the street.
Mm.
The last of them picked up for forced removal. It would be foolish to disguise the gravity of invincible confidence, the sight of two Americas, while the nation's most famous crossdresser lifts her lamp. My gut revels at the public shaming ritual.
Oh, very good. Yeah, yeah. I picked up some of those same phrases that she did. So anyone else? I'll read mine. I cheat a little bit because I actually did my list before you all did, but as I wrote it, I just scratched out the phrases. So mine I called An Hysteria of Spies. At first brush with dangerous positions, I search for the contraband of the mind, a sort of shortwave, developing a genius for recovery, preferring a ritual merrymaking instead of a diverse shipbuilding, so to speak. I laugh and chant in a spring transformation. The gravity of the hour is thus always political. Spying involves an engagement of the masses, though there might be heavy losses. With culture all around, now I prefer the Japanese way of the mind, one into cross-dressing, not for public shame, but for her life's defiance. Okay, well, did anybody else have any comments you want to make about that exercise? I hope you found it fun to do at least, and you can go back and look at the other passages if you didn't have time, and you can actually do this on your own. Just go to your library or your bookshelf and pull down books and get some words and inspiration that way. Are there any final questions about that before we move on?
Gary, we did have a comment that the exercise was very helpful, and another comment that the poems were all really awesome.
Yeah, well, it is amazing what you can produce right on the spot. And I used to attend workshops with Herb Martin, the poet laureate at UD, and he would just write a poem on the board from words that were thrown out. And we're going to talk a little bit about doing something like that in a minute. So let's go to the next slide, Elizabeth. And I'm going to give you some poems. To start with, one of my favorite writers is Elizabeth Bishop. She's known as a poet's poet. My editor at the Paris Review was Richard Howard, and he knew Elizabeth, and he once said to me that one time she looked at a library in someone's home where they were, and Elizabeth just said, or somebody said, aren't you impressed by all these books or such and such? And she says, no, just a bunch of other people's opinions. So that's what all this is. This is just a bunch of other people's opinions. So this is her opinion about one art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. And I start with this because everybody's lost your keys or something and you can't find it. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 lovely cities. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I owned. 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like write it, like disaster. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this poem, but this is one of the poems that I use to introduce formal poetry. And as I said before, I basically was motivated to do this kind of formal approach to poetry because I found that the students I had at Sinclair had never been asked to do anything with this much discipline. This one doesn't, of course, have meter necessarily, but it does have rhyme. And we know that these days, well, for a long time, free verse has hoarded over formal verse. And I believe in a certain decorum in a poem, as the textbook would call it. But if you read a much contemporary poetry, it's kind of a free-for-all now. And you will notice that everybody is trying all different things, from interspersing prose poetry or just prose, and different kinds of line breaks and different kinds of stanzas, and even adding photographs and making it a combination of fiction, memoir, poetry, everything kind of goes on. But these poems that I'm introducing you today are really in a tradition of formal poetry. And I hope you will try some of them. These will be exercises that you can do on your own. We won't try to force you to come up with rhymes and certain numbers of stanzas and so forth. But this particular one is technically called a villanelle. And you will notice right away that it becomes pretty easy because there are 2 lines that are repeated as in refrain. The art of losing isn't hard to master. To be lost, that is their loss is no disaster. The art of losing isn't hard to master. All the way down to variations on these. And that's another point I'd like to make, that just to write a villanelle or any of these kinds of formal poems doesn't mean that you have to be strict with them. You can work out different kinds of variations and changes in things, but it has to maintain at least some decorum to look like what a villanelle is. But this one, of course, deals with very limited rhymes: master, disaster, intent, spent, meant, went, vaster, disaster, gesture, so forth. Okay. We know that this is a very autobiographical poem for Elizabeth. She did live in 2 different continents. She lived in Brazil for many years, and she was on a river in Brazil, and when she taught at Harvard, she was on the Charles River. So she had these two rivers and the two continents and realms that she owned. And she relates that to, in very superficial things like losing your door keys and whatever. But the poem, of course, develops into something a little bit more personal when she says, even losing you, and you being the person who has the joking voice and some gesture. But at the end, the tone changes. It's evident the art of losing is not too hard to master. And then it takes her a little bit of time to even write that last line, because obviously the emotion is getting to her. What she's referring to here is her lover Lotta, who committed suicide. And so when she comes down to that last line, though it may look like she has to actually put in a parenthetical to make herself write it because it was a disaster. So Elizabeth, let's go to the next slide. And we have another Villanelle called The Waking by Theodore Roethke. Theodore Roethke was actually one of the teachers of one of my teachers, Carolyn Kaiser. He was a great poet mostly up in the poetry, the Pacific Northwest. The Waking. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I feel my fate in what I cannot fear. I learn by going where I have to go. We think by feeling. What is there to know? I hear my being dance from ear to ear. I wake to sleep and taking my waking slow. Of those so close beside me, which are you? God bless the ground. I shall walk softly there and learn by going where I have to go. Light takes the tree, but who can tell us how? The lowly worm climbs up a winding stair. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. Great nature has another thing to do to you and me. So take the lively air and lovely learn by going where to go. This shaking keeps me steady, and I should know what falls away is always and is near. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. So there's a simplicity to the lines and a simplicity to the refrain, which is repeated. And you notice how Roethke varies a little bit, and lovely, learn by going where to go. But you see that these two lines, these refrain lines are repeated throughout in a particular pattern. So let's look at that pattern, Elizabeth, in the next slide. So the Villanelle was originally a French form, but there is also an Italian form, and you'll notice in the word villa, and it usually was originally a pastoral. Do you all know what I mean by pastoral? This is the pastoral poetry of the early Romantic period. This is romanticizing the shepherd in his field. This is connecting with nature. It also, of course, means in the Italian, the villa, it's a kind of rustic homestead. So it is a kind of rustic poem. But you'll see that in terms of content, that has changed a lot. What hasn't changed is that the Villanelle will always have 19 lines. But anytime you say always with any formal poetry, you find that there are always going to be variations to that, and people will change it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the sestina. So you should have also noticed in those two poems that there are 3-line stanzas, and those three-line stanza is called a tercet. So you have 5 tercets, and then you have a final 4-line stanza, which we call quatrain, and it ends with a final rhyming couplet. So a couplet is 2 lines, quatrain 4 lines, tercet 3 lines. And you notice that the first and third lines repeat as refrains. That's what I was trying to point out with those particular lines. And that it has a very easy rhyme scheme of A, B, A, And that varies throughout the, I mean, that is pretty standard throughout the tercets until you get to the rhyming couplet at the end. And contemporary poems will use all different kinds of variations for this. So it's a simple form. I think it's simpler than starting with sonnets. And so I usually use this one after I do the little persona, what I call persona poem, or the dramatic monologue. So I hope you will try Villanelle's, and you can go to any, I recommend any kind of poets dictionary, poets encyclopedia. The Princeton one weighs like a brick, and all of these things are in there. And then there's one called A Book of Forms by Louis Turco, who was a Cleveland poet. All of these can be found in that. And so if I haven't explained it well enough, or you can't discern from the two examples that I gave you, that you can always go and nowadays you don't even need books, you just Google it, right? Okay, let's go on to the next one. Next slide. Okay, another poem by Elizabeth Bishop. And this again is a longer form, as you can see, and it's called a sestina. She tells you that right away. And invariably you will find sestinas will have longer lines probably, but not always. I know that John Ashbery has a sestina which has very short lines, and that just makes it a little bit more challenging. But see, as I read through this, if you can discern what the particular pattern is for a sestina. Sestina by Elizabeth Bishop. September rain falls on the house. In the failing light, the old grandmother sits in the kitchen with the child beside the little marble stove, reading the jokes from the almanac, laughing and talking to hide her tears. She thinks that her equinoctial tears and the rain that beats on the roof of the house were both foretold by the almanac, but only known to a grandmother. The iron kettle sings on the stove. She cuts some bread and says to the child, "It's time for tea now." But the child is watching the tea kettle's small, hard tears dance like mad on the hot black stove, the way the rain must dance on the house. Tidying up, the old grandmother hangs up the clever almanac on its string. Bird-like, the almanac hovers half open above the child, hovers above the old grandmother and her teacup full of dark brown tears. She shivers and says she thinks the house feels chilly and puts more wood in the stove. "It was to be," says the marble stove. "I know what I know," says the almanac. With crayons, the child draws a rigid house and a winding pathway. Then the child puts in a man with buttons like tears and shows it proudly to the grandmother. But secretly, while the grandmother busies herself about the stove, the little moons fall down like tears from between the pages of the almanac into the flower bed the child has carefully placed in front of the house. "Time to plant tears," says the almanac. The grandmother sings to the marvelous stove, and the child draws another inscrutable house. So this is a much longer poem, as you can see, and it does have sestets, which are 6-line stanzas. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. So that gives you 39. And then it ends with a tercet, 3 lines. So you end up with 39. So obviously this is a little harder to do. I have done this in a workshop, actually, with some retired nuns at the Sisters of Precious Blood up on Salem Avenue. And what you should notice is that, of course, there is no rhyme in this poem, so that makes it a little bit easier to work on. What you do have, however, is a repetition of end words. Do you see those patterns? So we start with 6 words: house, grandmother, child, stove, almanac, tears. And then you will notice that those 6 end words are repeated in a pattern, and I'll give you the pattern in a minute. So the next stanza repeats the last end word of the first stanza. So tears and tears. And then we sort of jump back and forth, but we still have house, almanac, grandmother, stove, child. Then child is repeated, child, tears, stove, house, grandmother, and so forth and so on. You see how that works? And then finally, at the very end, in what we call the tercet at the end, which is called an envoi, French term, because this form, by the way, was done a lot by French troubadours, which I'll talk about in a minute. You will notice that it ends with 3 words, almanac, stove, and house. And then the other 3 remaining words, tears, grandmother, and child, are embedded in those last 3 lines, the last tercet. Okay. So that's basically the form, the decorum of the poem. And I'll give you in a minute the exact pattern for repeating it. So let's go on to another sestina. And this is one that I was forced to write. And Elizabeth's going to put it right. So one of my teachers was Galway Cannell. I don't know if you're familiar with Galway, but all of my great teachers are dead. Well, yeah, they're all dead now, except for Richard Howard, my other teacher, and my poetry editor, who I just actually got a letter informing me that he has dementia. So I'm very sad about that. But Galway, in a workshop that I took with him out in Squaw Valley one summer, it was kind of strange because we were in a ski lodge and there was no snow, but there were all these mountains around, and I really don't particularly like mountains. I find them sort of oppressive. And he said, you need to go out into these mountains and write something for me. And I wasn't usually somebody who was inspired sitting around by nature. I could write something on a bus. Actually, I used to write a lot on a bus when I would take my daughter to Sinclair's nursery school. And those poems tend to be very short because the bus is very jerky and you can't write long lines. Well, going out in the mountains, I had a lot more time to write. And I happened to be reading some book that had Sir Philip Sidney's poems in it. And so I didn't know what to do with this assignment. And so I liked his words, and his words were stains, rest, volley, tick, morning, and something with ings on the end of it. And so I basically stole those words, and I'll talk about there are different ways that you can motivate yourself to write this kind of a poem. And so part of this is based on the fact that I was in a workshop, and that I was out in the woods, and that I had just written a poem. It was an assignment for him, but I was sitting on my patio before I went out to Squaw Valley, and I was reading a biography of one of my favorite novelists, E.M. Forster, and I discovered that his middle name was Morgan. So I started thinking about Morgan, and particularly his mother, who was a very dominating influence in his life. So I created these 2 characters, Mother and Morgan. And so when Galway said, go out and write something, I thought about this character, Morgan, going out into these mountains and not being too inspired by it. So the first poem I'd written was called Morgan Becomes a Horse. And this one I just called Morgan in the Mountains. And I decided to kind of explore the sestina form, which I hadn't written before, and which I had gotten from Sir Philip Sidney and stealing his words. And so this is what I came up with. And the reason I'm showing you this is because when you do this, you can get away with a lot. And you'll notice that I change and vary the end words so that it doesn't become too repetitious. Morgan in the Mountains. Every rock streaked with runes, figured with mount stains, where countless bodies sought views. He for rest. Stopping, he might find a stick to wave in a volley from peak to peak. invoking natural magic. Something must tick, he hoped. Granite clocks or the hearts of goat herd God's morning, a fallen pet, honoring it with echoes and an even number of ings, delivering, praising, missing, wondering, listening for Eve's ring. He found not one pastoral event, not even a modern mountain train. The bark on his branch cracked and fell. Underneath, he found more rings than any ancient trees. These were tiny tunnels, exposed, with 4 rests where the insect had stopped, changed directions in a rustic musical rhythm until the labyrinth came to an end in a final wooden valley. Staring at this fate, he learned not magic from these valleys, but something as unexplainable. If one could discover Eve's ring in these rocks, or buried in the pine needle piles, maybe hear a cow mew among uncow-like terrain, or find carved like a label MTS, then no matter what stony path he followed through whatever forest, a protecting paradise would be no sad beginning, but a monumental morning. Morgan found none of these. Out of the pine dark came the morn's ring of light onto a thumb-shaped stone where a man lay naked, Pan in this valley, while a woman in purple heels, chaste black wrapped around her, Diana of this forest, looked on, both humming to pleasure-giving gods. These 3 convening in natural lust, investing strangers with glamour as they mounted the light, the stone and the tree, caught within a pagan music. Far below, tiny buildings sheltered tiny people as the sound of muzak drifted into the primeval chant of wood jays. And this triangle of morning as the man stood up, stretched his arms touching the horizon along the mountains, greeting his happiness, though he crooned poorly in this echoing valley. Morgan raised his hand, stopping the violation with an even ring of his transformed stick against the bell-shaped cones hanging in the forest. Worn trails cluttered with rocks consented to move them out of this forest through conscious plants into a cheerful cave where unfamiliar music accompanied their rite, while Diana slipped with the advent of evening, falling back to the tiny people still trying to understand the morning. Morgan sensed the real draw of polished granite, of empty valleys, knowing that writing down nature would not provoke these mountains. What he knew from the forest and in the cave was music, body sounds swaying in pleasing volley, mountain to mountain, until evening only welcomed what would come in the morning. So you see, I've stretched the lines for my first, and if I would write another sestina, I might be a little bit more compressed with my lines, but I combine a kind of biography of E.M. Forster with my workshop assignment, which I didn't particularly like, and with reading Sir Philip Sidney and about pastoral poetry and those goat herd gods and the pagan sound and Diana and Pan, all of that came from Sir Philip Sidney. So it just all sort of worked out in that way. So Elizabeth, if you'll give me the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about these sestinas. She'll have to rotate it here so we can read it. So the word sestina literally means 6 rhymed, yet there are really no rhymes required in this kind of a poem. As I said, it was popular with 13th century troubadours for their oral recitations. We know, of course, that poetry is the oldest form of literature because it was all oral and it used a lot of mnemonic devices, rhythm and rhyme, and even things like epithets. If you've read any of the epics, the Homer epics or the Aeneid, you know that epithets are these short descriptive phrases that take the place of proper nouns. Instead of having to say Athena all the time, you would say gray-eyed goddess, that kind of thing. So you can use epithets, you can use rhyme, you can use rhythm, and these are all oral mnemonics, and the 13th century troubadours liked this kind of form for that. So it ended up being a 39 line poems, as I said, with these sestets, 6 of those giving you 36. And then the tercet, or called an envoi at the very end, for the 39 lines. And the end words are repeated in a set pattern instead of rhymes. Now, as I point out, the tercet, that last 3 lines, will use all 6 of the end words, but in no particular pattern. So at the very end, you can use whatever 3 end words you want for the last envoi end words, and then the remaining 3, just embed them somewhere. I've actually seen, them in some sestinas embedded in 1 line instead of in 3, but I try to do it in 3. So the pattern, as it turns out, starts with any 6 end words: A, B, C, D, E, F. You assign, if that helps, you can assign them letters. And then you'll notice basically what happens is that you take that last one, the F, start with that, and then you jump back to the beginning and you go A, and then you jump to the end, and you've already used F, so you use E, and you jump back to the beginning, you use B, and then you jump to the end, you use D, and then C. So the same thing happens in the third sestet. C is repeated, and then you jump to the F, which was the beginning, and then back to the E. Is that right? That doesn't look right. Yeah. Is that right? Yeah. Anyway, you jump back and forth between all these things, and then you end up with this embedded ECA if you want, and then BDF, or any pattern works there. And as you saw, I varied the words a lot. Let me just look at some and give you some examples of what I did to make it a little bit more interesting, at least for me. So instead of, as Elizabeth Bishop did, in changing those, I had a lot of variation on ring, Eve's ring, and the INGs. And instead of music, at one point I used Muzak. And then I used the diacritical mark SIC, S-I-C, in brackets. So I say maybe I hear a cow moo, and of course I misspelled moo, it's M-U, and so it looks out like it's music instead of Muzak. And instead of saying mountains, I said MTS. So you can play around with it any way you really want. There are various ways that you can do it. As I said, I started by just stealing 6 words from another poet. That makes a sort of interesting exercise. And or you can free associate. That's sort of, I used to do that with my students. Well, actually, that's how I did it with the retired nuns of the Sisters of the Precious Blood. I threw out a word, and then they threw out what word they associate with that. I wrote it on the board, and we came up with 6 of those words. And then I had divided the workshop into 6 different groups. We could do that sort of like a Zoom session with breakouts. And each one would then come up with 1 line. I don't know if you know the exercise called, it's a surrealist exercise, and now I'm having a senior moment. What is it, Elizabeth? Do you remember? Exquisite corpse. It's called an exquisite corpse. Look that up. Google that. That's another interesting exercise. An exquisite corpse. The surrealists love that. And you come up with 6 random words, and then you make yourself write another 6-line stanza, and you force yourself to either use those exact words or you vary it. And you'll notice too how I don't know if you know the term enjambment. Enjambment means where there's not an end stopped. Usually we have an end stop. I actually wrote a poem once where every line was end stopped. And my teacher at that point was Alfred Korn. He said, "Oh, you can't write a poem, by the way, with every line being end stopped." Well, that's not true. You can do that, and I actually had it published in the Best American Poetry anthology. So you start with these 6 random words, free associate them, or you can sit down and just write a 6-line poem. Or maybe even get a 6-line poem that you already have written and start with those 6 words. So there are various ways to do it. When I stole the 6 words from Sir Philip Sidney, I just reversed them from the pattern that he had. And you could do that too. A friend of mine who is was a poet at the University of Cincinnati when I was teaching there, named James Cummins, or Jim Cummins. He was the curator of what's called down there the Elliston Poetry Room, which, by the way, is a great resource if you need poetry books or poetry magazines. I used to say to my students that the United States was filled with people who wrote poetry but didn't buy poetry. And I do have actually thousands of poetry books, which I did, by the way, Elizabeth, tried to donate to the Wright Library and they didn't want them. I've actually tried to donate them to many libraries. Nobody wants books. So anyway, that's when I stopped buying poetry books, then you would go to a resource like the Elliston Poetry Room. At the University of Michigan, where I did my graduate work, we had the Hopwood Room, and it was just a special room for poetry. Anyway, that was a little digression. Jim Cummins has written a whole book of sestinas called The Whole Truth, and they are all about Perry Mason. And he uses Perry Mason characters and subjects and words, and it's brilliant. It's a brilliant book. I think they're like 26 Perry Mason sestinas. And the form, of course, I think lends itself to some parody and some bits of humor. And you can always, there's some that I remember reading that are centered around pop culture. So nowadays, since my grandkids are into, well, the youngest ones are into The Simpsons, I might write a whole sestina based upon what my grandkids are seeing in The Simpsons, or, you know, anything can work in a sestina. So that's our last slide. And I'd like to, oh no, I'm sorry. Another form, let's go on to another form. This is a looser form. And okay. One of my favorite forms is called ekphrasis. And ekphrasis is a Greek word just meaning a work of art about a work of art, basically. And it can be a poem about a work of art. The most famous probably is John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. Go back and look at it and see how it is one. I used to organize poetry readings at the Dayton Art Institute with local poets, and I'd have them go to the Art Institute and select a piece of work there. And it can be any kind of work. It can be ceramic, it can be glass, it can be photograph, whatever, and sculpture, and write something about that. And then I would have the audience follow the poet around the galleries and read in front of the actual work. I have to tell you that the most popular work that everyone liked to write about was Edward Hopper's High Noon, which was one of the great works of art at the Dayton Art Institute. And now that the Dayton Art Institute is open again, on the weekends anyway, I encourage you to go over there and pick one of your favorite works of art and write a poem. One of mine is by the artist Joseph Cornell. And Joseph Cornell was famous for making these collages in shadow boxes. And some museums have a lot of them and some museums have none, but the Dayton Art Institute has one. And I was fascinated by it when I first discovered it. And by the way, the poet Charles Simic has a whole book based upon Joseph Cornell artworks too, I have discovered since this. So I went over there and I sat there on a bench, because you can take those little benches, and I looked at Joseph Cornell's shadow box, and this is a poem that I came up with. And this was when Alex was the curator or the director of the art museum, and so he had this published over there at the Dayton Art Institute, and I think I published it in Sinclair's literary magazine, 2 Flights. So it's called Boxman. Only you, self-taught, could elevate the box. This clapboard, bluish gray, postmodern in its blending of sculpture, painting, and collage. Everything collage for that matter. We stand in front and piece together our memories. A comet on the shore of Long Lake, Alpena, Michigan. A similar driftwood bench along Cape May, New Jersey. Many nights of stargazing above this very institute where you have come to rest, searching for Andromeda. A red pink of a moon rests away from its silver chain, pendulum-like. The metal hoop of obstacles you jumped, while you added slender mirrors to extend the poetry. That piece of wire fence has kept you out long enough, so you retreat to this box, a character out of Kobo Abe, creating your shadows, spinning your spool of orbits. The cold of the northern sky warmed by Ursa Minor. Imaginations leap where Perseus Cepheus reside, where this utopia parkway man finds his own fancy, his aesthetic among winter skies placed upon a mantle, hung with a celestial map of his mind and his lost being. So in this poem, of course, I'm trying to describe the work that I see, but I also try to relate it to myself. So those are my memories of summers in Alpena and Cape May, but also into something that I was recently reading at the time I wrote this, which was a novel called The Boxman by the Japanese writer Kobo Abe. And then I also make reference to some biographical aspects of Joseph Cornell. He actually did live in Flushing on Utopia Parkway. And Deborah Solomon has written a wonderful biography of Joseph Cornell, which she called Utopia Parkway. So there are many things that you can do with an ekphrastic poem. So let's go to the next slide. Elizabeth, and we'll talk a little bit about ekphrasis. Sometimes it's spelled with a K, sometimes it's spelled with a C. The purpose, of course, is basically to make the reader envision the work, and you can describe it in a lot of detail, as if you were, physically present there in front of the work. I, as an exercise, have done this with students where I ask them to write a purely descriptive passage about a work of art, and then without seeing the work of art, I would send a student to the board and have the poet read it and have the other student draw it. Of course, they didn't want to draw, but I said, you just use stick man and whatever and try to draw. And so we would see how, because the poem itself has to be successful without looking at the work or actually seeing the work of art. Now, there are many anthologies, by the way, of poems. I mean, many museums, the Art Institute of Chicago has an anthology of paintings in their gallery with poets who have written about them. At one point, I was trying to get one together for the Dayton Art Institute, but I never really finished that work. I do still have all the poems that the local poets wrote about the works there. And it has no particular form or rhyme or meter or rhythm, so you can work with it. And as I said, if you are familiar with John Keys's Ode on a Grecian Urn, you know that basically what he does is to look at this vase, this Grecian vase, and describe what he sees on the front, and then he moves to the back of the vase and shows you what he sees there. And then he relates it and comes up with one of the most quoted lines of poetry: truth is beauty, beauty is truth. And therefore, that's all we need to know. That's a paraphrase. But so it can do more than just describe. Some things that I used to suggest to my students would be to try to just give the object, give the work of art a voice. And that sort of is a combination of that ventriloquist persona, dramatic monologue kind of a poem. And you develop a voice of what a painting or a sculpture, a photo or whatever might have. Some people who maybe have dabbled in art and know something about brushstrokes and the mediums, clay and paint and whatever, could write about how the artist uses that media. Obviously, you can reference the artist, as I did with my few little biographical things about Joseph Cornell. By the way, when you watch PBS and you see them give a list of who has, what foundation has donated to this particular PBS project, you will hear the name Joseph and Robert Cornell Foundation. Well, Robert was Joseph's brother who was mentally challenged. And so he took the money that he made from his art and turned it into a trust fund, a foundation, And that's who Joseph and Robert Cornell is. And I always think of Joseph Cornell when I watch PBS programs and they mention that. And as I said, you can walk around the work of Keats. Sculpture generally is made to walk around, but many museums don't do that. One of my pet peeves with the ancient gallery at the Dayton Art Institute, because I was a docent at the Art Institute, by the way, and I taught a course on Greek art and poetry and mythology for years, a team taught with the art history professor, Sally Struthers. We did that for about 10 years. We actually traveled through Greece for 3 weeks and put together that course. Anyway, they have a cycladic figure, and the cycladic figures were all funereal. They were burials, and they were on these Cyclades, these islands off of the main coast of Greece. And they have it actually standing up, but it would have never been standing up. It would have been lying with these coffins or whatever, these funeral things. So you want to obviously have some description, but the poem can obviously go well beyond just merely describing, because I would think that, well, I'm thinking back to when at the turn of the century, and Ezra Pound would say, you know, you have to make something new, and he was very much into creating images. And I'm remembering the poet, I've just been reading a new biography of Sylvia Plath, and A. Alvarez would talk about her images and say, well, you know, her poems are great and they have wonderful images, but guess what? They go beyond the image. So you can create a lot of images in a ekphrastic poem, but it doesn't have, it should go, you know, one step beyond just merely describing, I think. But I think that's a good way to initially start. So I don't, you know, expect you to write any of these kinds of formal poems, but I expect you to, you know, as you read them, and try the Petrarchan sonnet. That's sort of my favorite. And again, I had a poet teacher, Michael Harper, who made me write a Petrarchan sonnet. And so, being a smartass, I had been reading about Petrarch and Laura, his love. And so I said, okay, if he's going to make me write a Petrarchan sonnet, I'll write it about Petrarch and Laura. Well, he liked it and published it, so that worked out fine. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, and it looks like we have at least, I see some questions maybe on chat, or you can raise your hand and Elizabeth can let you speak. And maybe Elizabeth, why don't you just let everybody speak here? We have a free-for-all at the end. Anybody who wants to say anything or have comments or questions, tell me how you hated these forms and you'll never write this or whatever. Oh, there's Dawn. I see Dawn. That's a nice picture. Hi, Dawn. Hi. There's Amy. It's very odd. It's very odd because I'm used to these Zoom classes, you know, and not be able to see all of you. So would anyone have questions, comments?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, in the first exercise that you had,
Uh-huh.
is it necessary to give credit to any of the articles or wherever you find these words? I wouldn't think so, because it's just almost like going to a dictionary.
Yeah, okay, there is a form that I haven't talked about. It's called, you can Google this. It's called a cento, C-E-N-T-O. And that's where you will write a poem in which you copy out the exact words, rearranging them, okay? That's a different kind of poem from that exercise. But I have written poems where I would take phrases from watching a Shakespeare play, because I taught Shakespeare. So I would take my students and, you know, they were watching the play, and I would just write down some words that grabbed me from the Shakespeare play. And so one of my editors asked me once, he said, now, is this a cento? And I said, well, no, I didn't really copy, you know, the exact words and put them in the same order. So no, you don't have to credit them in that sense. If it happens to be a phrase sometimes that I know would be associated with a certain person, I put quotation marks in it.
Okay, great, because I was writing an article for a group that I have online, and so I don't think it was a cento, like you said, but like when taking writing in college, I just read the articles and rephrased it pretty much in my own writing. But I did give credit to both of those articles, and I
Oh, yeah.
may have put something in quotations, but I guess you're saying necessarily that you don't have to necessarily do that unless you're
Well,
using
yeah.
direct quotes.
Especially not in a poem necessarily, but if you're writing an essay or something, obviously, and there's the fine line with plagiarism in there, but look up, another kind of poem, of course, is what's called a found poem. And in a sense, a cento is a found poem. And you would call it a found poem, and then that gives it credit to where you found it. And I've written those kind of poems too. Okay, anyone else? Questions?
I was just seeing if you could also reference maybe some of the different poems that you read today.
You mean where they were referenced? Well,
if you can actually just say like the title and the author of some of the poems, if we can find that somewhere, if I want to take a look at that later. Thank you.
Okay, does she mean the ones that we did in class, or
just the ones that you read, like from The Lady with the Lakes, and there was a couple other poems that you might have read today?
The poems that were read today are all in the handout.
yeah?
So I put a link. I'll put the link to the handouts in the chat again. It's
Or did you
at
want to
the-
know where my poems were published? I mean, I'm not sure what your question is.
Elizabeth answered my question, but if
Okay.
also we can get your works too, that would be great. Thank you very much. I enjoyed.
Okay, we'll do that. Any other questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Oh, yeah.
Dawn,
Okay,
did you have another question?
somebody just asked about my email. So my number is, I'll give it over the session. It's Gary, Gary dot Mitchner, Mitchner @gmail.com. Be glad to see any of the work that you've done, and I'll be glad to comment if you want, but let me know that. I mean, if you just want me to read it, that's fine too. And Elizabeth, did you have something else?
Let's see here. The email address. Oh, take down the share screen. Sorry. Good idea. Sorry about that. There you go.
That's why they can't see.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry about that.
Oh, there's Debbie Shank. Hi, Debbie. I don't see her, but I see her name. I know her. Who else do I know? Anybody else there? I don't know anybody else. I don't see. I thought I saw Joy. Is Joy still on? Joy Swap, are you there?
She was here. Just a note. I see a note that you're unable to see anyone except Gary and Elizabeth. That was because of the way we have it set up. So,
Okay.
any other questions about poetry?
2 participants raised hand.
Okay. Let's see. Deborah, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Right. I just want to thank Gary.
Oh, hi, Debbie.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I really enjoyed it. This is out of my comfort range, but I am trying to expand myself.
Oh, good.
And I really did enjoy it, and I've learned a lot from it, and will pursue just the art itself. I'm obviously not doing it for anything other than to really just broaden one's horizons. And
Well, stop by my house. You can borrow some of my books.
there you go. Sounds like a deal.
Actually,
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your comments. Was there another one, a hand up?
I think that's it. John, if you had another question, you can unmute and ask, but if not, I think, let's see.
You have a couple minutes.
I didn't have anything further. So, okay. So you can actually see the picture sometimes.
I see your picture. Yeah, I don't see your actual face, but I see your picture, the picture of your face.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to everybody who joined.
Okay, well, thank you, Gary. I want to remind everybody that we do have one more workshop in this series. It is May 4th, and the topic is 10 all-time best writing lessons from 10 years of interviews with the all-time best writers with Jessica Strasser. She is both an author and an editor at Writer's Digest. And that is going to be Tuesday, May 4th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And if you are on this webinar, you'll be getting all this information in an email from me on Monday or Tuesday. So look for that. And thank you all so much for coming. And Gary, thank you for presenting today.
Okay, thank you.